Okay, welcome everyone to this panel discussion hosted by CSA Research. My name is Arl Lomel, and today I'm joined by three industry luminaries to be talking about the role of data in formulating your global strategy. I'm joined today by Daniel Sullivan with GitLab, Jamie Punishill, who was formerly CMO at Lionbridge, and Wayne Borland, who's head of localization at Dell. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the ways that you can use data to help promote the view of localization and globalization as strategic imperatives rather than just cost centers within an organization. For as long as I've been involved with the localization industry, there's been this issue that organizations are just treated as though localization is a cost to be cut. And right now, when there's worries about inflation and worries about recession and other things, it's important to find ways to convey the value of localization and demonstrate that it is a positive contributor to organizations. Just a bit of background for this, we hope that this will promote you or prompt you to come up with your own questions, to ask them to us. So you can put questions into the chat within StreamYard if you're there. On LinkedIn, on LinkedIn, you can put them into the, there's a place to put them in discussion there. And my colleague Don DePalma will be monitoring and promoting questions that we see as important. So with that, I'm going to ask each of the panelists just briefly to introduce themselves, and then we'll start with some questions I have prepared and anything that you all bring up in the audience. So just going from top in my view, Daniel.
Sure. My name's Daniel Sullivan, and I've been running enterprise localization teams for about 12 or 13 years now. And I'm currently at GitLab as of January of this year. Extremely excited to be here. I'm delighted to be back at a smaller company. And another thing that makes this opportunity really exciting for me is that we're literally starting from zero here. So like there's nothing in place and we're building it all right now. And of course, data infrastructure will be a key component of that. So, and happy to be here.
Okay, thank you. Jamie?
Thanks, Arl. Sorry, couldn't find the mute button. I'm Jamie Punishill. As Arl said, I was the former CMO of Lionbridge, where I sort of had two hats. Both had to convey, talk about localization and Lionbridge, as well as manage our own internal, marketing localization efforts. I'm probably the relative newcomer here into localization. Really, only been doing this for about 6 or 7 years. So I've had that responsibility. Spent most of my time in financial services and various digital and business line executive roles, but really come at this from a strategy and an ROI perspective.
Wayne Borland with Dell. Been with Dell for about 24 years now. Been involved in localization in some form or fashion for about the last 14. And for the last, I guess, 4 or so years have managed everything translation, internationalization, interpretation across Dell Technologies.
Okay. So to me, part of the reason why we chose you all as panelists is that you represent very different perspectives on this. Daniel's been at this for a long time, but he's in almost a startup mode for this, where everything has to be justified from the ground up. Wayne's been doing this a long time, so you have a very mature operation that has a legacy of data. And then Jamie's representing an LSP perspective that was trying to figure out how do we use data to how do they facilitate data to use data to facilitate what their customers are doing. So with these different perspectives, I thought we'd start out by asking each of you to talk a little bit about how you've used data on the ROI of localization, whatever sources you may have used to facilitate your business goals. And maybe Wayne, we'll start with you in that very mature perspective. How have you worked with data?
Yeah, it's interesting because you're right. We have this wealth of data around our processes. Millions and millions of rows of data. But really the key when talking to stakeholders or executives within the company is talking in terms of what's important to them and what their key KPIs are, which really usually have nothing to do with the data that I have. So the real challenge is getting data that's important to them, whether it's on call drivers or it's on, sales revenue or whatever the case may be. And then also trying to get them to understand, translations for the business is really about scale, right? If you think about a marketing campaign and all the weeks that go into developing a campaign and the money spent with ad agencies and executive reviews, and then you turn over to my team and within a week we give it back to you in 12 languages and it costs you a few $1,000s. That's tremendous scale for the organization. So I think really all that wealth of data that we have is great for sort of driving our own efficiencies, but kind of misses the point when you're talking to the majority of our stakeholders.
Yeah. That's been a long-standing theme that when we look at what most localization groups call KPIs, they're completely meaningless within the rest of the organization. I mean, you go to the marketing team and say, great, we've improved leverage by 15%. They're going to go, you've improved what?
Exactly.
Why do I care?
That's that. So anecdote here is I was just at Shopify for 3.5 years, and again, they had some infrastructure in place there, but we were really building things from start there too. And that is the first time where I didn't start building out operational dashboards for localization until the end of year 2. I mean, that's how low on the priority it was for us. It was like, how much volume, how much is it costing us, was not something that I was being asked about at all. Not at all. It was more like, what are our top 20% performing pages? What can we do to iterate on those to get them to perform 1 or 2% better than they were yesterday, and constantly iterating on those things. It was a really powerful eye opener for me. I started playing around with SEO at Tableau, and trying to find ways to incorporate, the keyword research and usage of keywords in content as a part of the localization process, as opposed to something that happens after the fact or something that a separate team does. And that really highlighted for me, like, this is the thing that like I can talk about these numbers to pretty much anyone in the business and it registers with them. Our operational KPIs, they're still important, obviously, because we all have conversations with procurement and finance at the end of the year too. So it's important to have those. But I now lean way toward performance metrics, and that differs from like a marketing website to a blog to support. How you're measuring success there is going to differ, and I find that aligning to how those teams measure success, all boats rise.
Okay.
Yeah, just picking up on that. Yeah, just picking up on that, Arl. I mean, I think, and Wayne and Daniel in their own ways, hit it. This is a strategy issue and then a strategy alignment issue, right? And really beginning to make the case that whatever it is, whether it's localizing a campaign or localizing a page or localizing an app or what have you, aligns against strategy and those KPIs. And the thing that struck me, or was so surprising to me when I came into the industry, 7 years ago now, was how much it focuses on the factory and the performance of the factory. And look, we've got this Six Sigma, highly efficient factory that nobody cares about, or the way they care about it is it will be a CFO and a COO conversation about efficiency and cost. So if you want to be at a strategic level and not be perceived as the cost center, then you've got to have the strategic conversation. And this is a little off kilter, but just as an example, I happen to be part of the team that was developing social media for Citibank in the very early days of corporate social media. And, so many of the folks in social media wanted to make it about social media and social media metrics and likes and views and impressions. And I was at Citibank, and the single biggest line item on the P&L at Citibank was the call center. And so if we could figure out how to use social media to deflect calls, I could have infinite funding, because it was such an easy P&L to shrink. And, Wayne alluded to it. And so I think as you get into the localization discussion, you're both thinking about impact on the market, that is, how important is this per market and that market relative to our business, but speak to your business. What are the KPIs or the business levers that will get you the funding and the attention? And it might be service, it might be call deflection, it could be marketing efficiency, could be marketing impact. Be different for every business, but start there, and that's how you'll create sort of your strategy case and your funding case.
Yeah, this is really interesting, I think, because so many people have come into this field out of love for language, and they want to keep focusing on language without, I think, realizing that language is just a strategic asset at the end of the day, as far as the company's concerned. The company really, at some level, doesn't care how well you're doing in Germany as long as you're making money for them.
Well, actually, interesting, Arl. They don't care how well you're doing in German. They'll ask how we're doing in Germany.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Whether or not
Very
it's
good
in
distinction.
German is, in some sense, it's irrelevant. Now, to all my folks in the audience from Germany, I apologize, because I know it's highly relevant from a German customer perspective. But from the business perspective, it isn't. It's just, do the business results meet the business targets? And that now the challenge for all of us is how to show that doing things in German or in a more appropriate German cultural way will then lift that performance.
German's kind of a tricky example too, though, because they have such a high tolerance for English, and I don't remember my numbers at Shopify, but I remember at Tableau, even with all the localization we were doing for German, about 50% of the traffic coming out of Germany with a browser language preference for German, they were still going to English content. And I would anecdotally ask people at conferences and stuff like, which language are you using? And any German that would say, I'm looking at English. And I'd say, why? And like, we spent all this money on these videos or these pages. Why are you looking at the English? It's like, oh, I like her voice better. The voice actor for the English videos better. Or, occasionally you get someone who would say, I'm just used to not trusting the localization quality of non-German companies. And so I default to English. You'll hear some of that. But there's still half of that market is still definitely showing a preference for and consuming content in German. And so there still is a valid reason for providing that content in German.
I do wonder, Daniel, how much of that is because of how poor so many localization efforts are.
Oh yeah,
Absolutely. So yeah, it's easy. They're going to get better and more content in whatever the default language is of that company.
Yeah,
let's
100%.
use English here, and they know it, right? In most cases, very few folks have 100% localization, wrapping around the globe. And while they have a high tolerance for English, they also have a low tolerance for poor German translations.
They 100% do.
Absolutely.
That is correct. That is correct.
We're getting a bunch of comments coming in on this, and one of them I think is directly relevant to what you observed, Daniel, where they said bilingualism. Nicola says bilingualism is a huge factor, but I would argue that there's also a huge indicator that a business needs to understand their market demographics and localize accordingly. And I hear you talk about Tableau. Those are relatively educated users who probably were educated in English, and that's going to be, for certain topics, actually closer to their native language than German would be. But if you're off selling to grandmas in rural Brandenburg in Germany, it's going to be a completely different story. So you have to look at what is it we're doing, who's our audience.
Even like I've even heard this anecdotally among like engineering teams, for example, non-native English speaking engineering teams, where the manager group has a higher level of familiarity and comfort with English. And the junior engineers definitely have a preference for in-language content. And you guys make a really good article that it's one of these perennial ones that I always go back to. The can't read won't buy one, which has really good data on this. It's not just about whether they can read it and whether or not they're going to buy it, but you guys just have a lot of really good third-party data on that. Even like the best data I have at GitLab, I'm not going to have a lot of those numbers that you have. And so having those sorts of resources to dovetail your first party data, I think, is really important for making cases at the executive level.
There's, by the way, you're getting some love for your work at Shopify in the comments where people are saying, hey, that Shopify was top notch. So,
oh yeah, that was amazing. That was amazing place. Yeah.
And there's also a comment I'll toss in here that I don't know how much this affects any of you, but for some of our clients, the ROI isn't necessarily the driver, but it's legal requirements. So Ingve Rönecke says, aren't there sometimes legal requirements for translating into the native languages? And absolutely, for some of our clients, that's the top driver.
Product documentation is a good example. Anytime we're doing like T's and C's and sales contracts and stuff like that, depending on the country, there's absolutely a requirement. So that does certainly drive some of it.
Yeah.
And Arl, I'd argue that in that case, it's still an ROI conversation because it's existential, right? Like there, you have zero ROI if you don't do it, right? And whether we're talking about, in Canada or Switzerland or wherever, where you've got a lot of these legal requirements.
Yeah. Okay. The next question I've got for you is, I think we've really covered why you need data and some of the ways you'd use it. So if you could wave a magic wand and get access to any sort of data, whether or not it's feasible today, what really would be your top of list for data that you would have to make this case? So I don't know, maybe Wayne, if we want to start with you.
Yeah, I think looking at existing TAM, so total addressable market, is an important one. Existing sales or contracts or consideration data, revenue, either realized or projected, all those are really important. The key is, tying that the impact of localization efforts to those KPIs, right? Or the lack of them. And I think that's where the problem really comes in, especially in large companies like Dell, where there's a multitude of activities focused on improving those KPIs, right? So in a situation where the local markets or the sales makers are saying, just give me something to sell, even if it's in English, you've got that dynamic going on. But you've also got, just the challenge of, with so many things going on, how do you show that, hey, it was the fact that we localized this content that drove increased CSAT or drove increased revenue, or the case may be. It's really difficult to kind of get to that proof point. And you can't really do A/B testing, especially if we've already been doing content in that language for 2 decades. You can't take it away and then say, oh, let's see if your revenue goes down, right? So I think it's a challenge of getting access to the data, which is sometimes very challenging in companies, but then it's being able to actually tie that, what you're doing in the localization team, to those improvements that are being seen.
Yeah, I think the closest thing that I've had like this was again at Shopify, and it was making a case for a simplified Chinese site that was not based in the People's Republic of China. So when I got there, and I think a lot of folks on the call probably realize this, but China's a tough nut to crack. And more often than not, you're going to have more success, at least from a web traffic and management standpoint, if you've got a website on servers on the Chinese side of the server, or the China wall.
Great firewall.
The firewall, yeah. And we had one of those. Was never really performing well. And there were lots of reasons for that. But I started building a case, and it was almost exclusively with third-party data and some web traffic data for building a simplified Chinese site that was global in nature. So kind of like an international Spanish site, but for Chinese, for that diaspora. Because we also know there's a large Chinese diaspora outside of the PRC. And much to our surprise, once we had that built and we started getting telemetry, we saw massive volumes of people coming out of places like Norway or the Netherlands. And these are Chinese browser preference, and they're coming to our non-PRC Chinese site, so the global China site. And in the end, it turned out that those were probably a lot of VPN traffic coming out of China, but through a VPN in Norway and the Netherlands. But in the end, that site vastly outperformed the one we had set up for the PRC. And our audience was probably not that diaspora that our data, we thought we were seeing in our data, but it was probably people in the PRC just going through VPN.
Okay. Arl, so I'll bring I mean, I can't help it because I'm a marketer. think like a marketer. So everything really, is, understand your audience, understand your entire buying journey. And that's part of what makes it so difficult. And the customer experience journey for that matter, makes it difficult for somebody like Wayne, where you've got a bunch of things in market, and then systematically look for what you think the key levers are. And I think Julie asked a question, where is it easier? You can test, even in large organizations, you can do, there's ways to do testing. If we couldn't, organizations would never change. It's harder, but there are things that we can do. And there are parts of it that are easier to test. Marketing might be easier to test some of these things, to then create the momentum and the use case for saying, okay, what would that look like for product documentation or FAQ questions or servicing, or for chatbot, or even for the application. But this goes back to understand your buyer, understand what the key levers are, and I think whether it's can't read, won't buy, or something, Arl, that I'm passionate about, and we had been working on with the GRF, the global revenue forecaster, if this is even trying to figure out which language and which markets make sense. You've got to come at this from a strategic perspective that says this will create a lift in whatever activity, that is in shopping cart completion or in lower service requests. And then here's where language makes the difference or doesn't make the difference. Create a relative list and start working right through them, because there are some that are going to be super impactful, and some that they'd be nice to have, but they can wait.
That's a really good point, because when I was at Tableau, we did 8 languages, and it was always like this. There was always this undercurrent of frustration within the company, especially among the international teams, that when are we going to do more languages? When are we going to start expanding out? When are we going to add things like Dutch and things like this? And I spent a ton of time building spreadsheets, cross database joins, articulating my first party data with third party data in these very beautiful dashboards, a massive amount of work. And even when I went on to Shopify, I started doing this as well. But the thing I kept bumping into was there's like 8 to 12 markets that move the needle, irrespective of which industry you're in. It's funny because they'll kind of shift around and rank a little bit, but it's this block of like low hanging fruit that's the same no matter what company you're in, no matter what maturity level you are. So for me to make a case for adding French or German or Japanese, for example, it's very easy, right? Because the World Online Wallet, you guys have great articles on this. It's there. It's when you do start to get into some of these markets like Dutch, or some, just even the top of the long tail, that it gets a lot trickier. And I think that those decisions, maybe they're starting in localization sometimes, but ultimately it's a business decision, and you're not just doing it for you're not making a decision for one department. It, like, if you decide to localize, it's like, okay, now we need to unlock legal, and we need to unlock product, and it's like, it's this huge chain. And so you're all in it together, or you're not doing it. And if you're not doing it all together, then I think problems can introduce themselves pretty quickly. So I think when you are using data to make a case for moving into new markets and things like that, it's best to just engage with the people who are going to be impacted the most. Like finance would be like one of the first places I would go to. Start with finance. They've got great numbers on things like ARR. Where's the recurring revenue coming from? And then I would go on to marketing and sales, because those are the things that are helping to drive those revenue streams.
So just to keep. Sorry, go ahead, Ben.
No, please.
Or Arl, sorry. Okay, so just to piggyback on top of what Daniel said, because I think it's such an important point. And again, the way I think of it, I'd be going to talk to the customer experience or customer satisfaction teams, or the digital teams, who've been spending just as much time with the CFO and the business parts of the organization, convincing them that no, digital transformation is everything. It isn't just the marketing materials, or isn't just the servicing site, or yes, customer satisfaction is every part of the buying journey. So there's a Loc is a lot like those things that are horizontals, that are trying to get businesses to change the way they approach their customer base and their market from front to back. And so here's the good news: you're not alone. There's other parts of the organization, and one could argue localization is actually one of the dimensions of digital transformation, or one of the dimensions of a full end-to-end customer experience or customer satisfaction journey transformation. So there's other groups to align with to be able to help make this case about how, one, that everybody has to do it, and how you can prioritize sort of the different parts.
Well, I'd like to ask Wayne specifically about this, because Wayne's working in a large organization where you've got these groups, but of course everybody's clamoring for their attention. So how can you stand out, Wayne, to get that attention you need to get the data you need, and also help build the case collaboratively with them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think this really starts talking to, so a localization leader needs to be much more than just an expert on localization, right? You need to have business acumen. You need to have financial acumen. You need to have networking skills. I think, it's a lot of, whether it's going and setting up one-on-ones with key stakeholders or key executives and building that network and building that understanding of what services you can provide. But it's, or maybe having internal QBRs, which is something we're really focused on starting this fiscal year, which is, we've gotten really good feedback from our stakeholders on, oh, I didn't know you guys did this, right? Because everyone's got this little silo of things that they've been engaging you on, and they might not know about it, the wealth of other services and things that you can do. So I think part of it is sort of having an internal marketing plan, right? Or almost like a business development plan. And then having, not just yourself as the leader, but people within your organization that can go out and establish these relationships. For us, Dell's obviously a very large company. We support some 120 teams a day. I can't keep up with those 120. I don't talk to all those different teams on a daily basis. So but I think kind of having that marketing strategy and that engagement strategy is really key. And it's an uphill battle, I'll be honest. But I think the only way that you're going to get there is by thinking about it from that perspective.
Yeah, and I think this raises another good point here, because some of what I'm hearing from Wayne is that massive organization, we've got you've got a lot of resources, but you have constraints that you're working within, right? And you've got a lot of asks coming at you, and so it's like, where do you apply your attention and focus? And one of, I think, the biggest eye openers I had starting at Tableau and then really learned about at Shopify was localization isn't just about taking English strings and translating them into other languages. It's not just that translation process, right? There's other, we talk about things like transcreation, right? There's like, that's a different level of investment in content that you're making, because it's going to probably take more time and it's kind of be more costly. And so you can't do that everywhere. I would say copywriting too. Like, we don't, in localization, we don't talk about copywriting much, but I very much think it should be a part of localization, because yes, we're not taking a source file and replicating that in English almost exactly, but you're still taking like source messaging that was developed probably at HQ and finding ways to communicate those values to non-English markets. And I don't think the translation workflows are necessarily all the right ways to do that. And I think data can prove that out for sure. I mean, like, if you're running a blog, that was what I learned so much at Shopify, running non-English blogs, and how different each market is. And how well or poorly translated collateral does versus copywritten or transcreated content. But we can't do this kind of stuff everywhere, right? Like, you can't like take an entire library of support content and decide we're going to get out of string translating business here because copywriting, copywritten content performs better, so let's copyright everything. No way. So in some ways, I think by leaning into performance, it does make our jobs a little bit more complicated, because we have to then have data to identify those areas where we're going to put more investment. But I think in the long run, localization will get more bang for its buck. And I think executives will see that, because they'll see that you're attending to places where it matters most. Like, right, if this content is supposed to be driving leads and it's not, that's not necessarily a localization problem, right? But localization can help make it, or help fix it, or make it better.
The irony is we call ourselves a localization industry, but we do very little localization.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's getting to be like that, and I think the AI revolution that we're all on the cusp of, and probably some of us are in various states of experimenting or just thinking about it. That's going to change a lot. That's going to change a lot, and I think some of the things that'll be impacted, especially, are going to be like string-based translation. Is going to change for sure, if not go away in some places.
Yep.
Well, and there's the thing, Daniel, right? Which is if you know it's one of the things that the industry struggles with is it gets a series of inputs or a series of raw materials. If you get horrible raw materials, it doesn't matter what kind of magic you work on it. You're either gonna it's gonna be a poor translation, or it's gonna cost you a small fortune because you're really not translating it. You're rewriting the whole darn thing because the source was a problem. And like this is to Wayne, you and go back to my sort of digital transformation, customer satisfaction thing. Localization isn't a thing, it's a belief, right, that we're going to adapt to the culture and buying behavior of the customers in market, which may or may not be a language thing, not for nothing, right? It could be imagery, that could be, as could be the way the shopping cart's structured, that can be currency, right, in the accounting system, and so on and so forth. And for so long it's been stuck at the receive whatever the quality of coal or gold or whatever you want to call it is, but you must produce the highest possible end product, and it's impossible. And to your point, this is where the call it a threat or call it the most exciting thing about the large language models and what it'll do, whether we're talking about writing code in multiple languages, or much less writing copy in multiple languages, where we've now tuned the model to say these are the brand values, this is the brand voice. Now, write as a copywriter in Iceland to 45 to 90-year-old, computer engineer buyers. I mean, it's crazy to think about how this will, the opportunity to fix this is.
So one thing I took away from this that both, I think from all of you is if, you're a localization manager out there and you're saying, I'm just not gaining traction with anyone, go take a night course on finance or do these kinds of things so that when you go sit down with the finance manager, you're localizing your own content in a sense to what they need, so you're speaking their language.
Yep.
And you're not saying something that they're just, oh, this guy doesn't know anything. You want to be credible. So go, learn about the other functions you address so that when you approach them, you're prepared. Just as a note, for those of you who've joined since the start, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them into the chat. We'll see them and hopefully address them. So, please do make comments. Now, there's one comment I've just been reading from Matthias Cesar. Reading the title, Data in Global Strategy, I was thinking, how is business data used in data analytics to take strategic decisions, and or how more GI specific, how can language data, let me see, or more guilt specific, sorry, some of that was cropped off in my view. How can language data in organizations be utilized for LLM training and the ultimate goal of hyper-customized engagement with partners, customers, and suppliers? That's kind of what you were headed at, Jamie, talking about that.
Yeah, and that's a interesting combination, like the beginning and the front of it. Sorry about that. I think there's look, there's no question you've got to get some analytics into the strategic decision side. I think we've spent most of our time talking about that, but I want to separate that I don't know that the data itself is going to be used for the large language model training. To me, this is more about and it's how we, I'm doing some consulting now for a Fortune 50, global insurance company. And this is, how can this actually help us do all the things that we've been trying to do for years, but never actually had the scale to achieve? Personalization is one of the great ones, right? I mean, probably been talked about before I got into business, but certainly, as early as I got into the digital sphere was the promise of personalization. And where it always breaks down is you can't scale it. Right? It's just too expensive to scale, and that to me is where I'd be opening up as a localization professional and thinking about how this finally lets us do these things at scale. We'll solve the source issue, as I was just talking about with Daniel. So if I'm not translating it from English, because I can have a large language model write it in 12 languages. Right now, we're really in the business of training and tuning output and measuring outcomes, which gets us out of the factory and closer to the business, which is the really at the meta level, the very discussion we're having. How is it strategic? How do we get funding? And how do we have business impact?
I'll just toss in one of the trends we've been monitoring that this ties in with is the emergence of what we call dialogic content, which is different from the standard, we compose, we push out to the world model of most organizations, but where you're actually entering into dialogue with individuals. And generative AI is something that can help facilitate this, but then it raises all sorts of other localization challenges now that you have these conversations going on in different languages that then need to be made intelligible to the organization. So, what was the resolution of this conversation going on in Albanian that I need to record so I know something about the history of interaction with this Albanian customer? And that's something that, in the past wouldn't have been done at all, wouldn't necessarily have been translated. And now there's a need for data on what's important. What do we translate here? What do we record? How do we maintain this knowledge? And I think organizations are just starting to grasp with that because of what Jamie has said. Suddenly these things are possible that weren't possible before.
I think they're grasping the enormity. Arl, I'm not sure they're grasping the impact and what it'll take to get there.
Yes,
we're still pretty early. We're pretty early in that stage.
A lot of misconceptions about what it'll take to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next question I had listed for you guys is, as you've tried to elevate these discussions around data with executives, what are the biggest misconceptions that you've encountered that they seem to have that people trying to elevate that should be prepared for?
Well, go ahead, Wade.
So Gen AI obviously is one. Gen AI can do it. It can do everything. That's one of the things we're facing today. But I don't think we want to have a Gen AI conversation. We could probably spend the day talking about that. But I think another one we face a lot is, customers in data centers speak English. So, and they're buying in those countries already. So why do we need to localize? That's one misconception we face. But the biggest one that's really challenging for me and reoccurs a lot, and Jamie hit on this earlier, was, I think a lot of times our business owners, especially in marketing and in the .com space, they lack an understanding that, this message, we're creating all this message in the US, for us anyway, we're a US based company. We're creating all this content in the US and it's being created by US based marketers. Some of those folks probably never even been outside the United States. And it often doesn't address the local marketing needs. And so we get, so it's not a translation problem, but it gets represented as one, right? We get feedback, hey, this is bad. The regions are saying we have to rewrite it. And you go and you look at it, and the reality is a lot of times it's source deviation because the content didn't meet the local needs in the first place. But getting that message across, because it's just so easy for people to just say, hey, you guys are doing a bad job in translation, fix it, instead of really stepping back and realizing that you're not doing a good job creating your content in the first place. You are for this specific region, but not for the rest of the world. So, it's a common misconception, and it's a really difficult one to combat.
Yeah, I'm always surprised by the number of issues that our localization teams and translators and editors and whatnot that they find in the source documentation.
Absolutely.
Relative to the localized ones, which when you hear about a problem with a localized asset, you can take it a little personally because it's your work, right? And But it's just surprising how many of those are not really, the root cause is not a localization problem. It's with that source content.
Well, we get thousands of queries a year from our translators. Well, why do we get thousands of queries a year?
Yeah.
Because the source content doesn't make sense to them.
Yes. Agreed. Yeah.
This will go right back to, do you understand your customer? Do you understand how the personas or ICPs or whatever your language is? And you said study finance. I would actually suggest study marketing.
Yeah.
If you look at how marketers, because I think marketing as a discipline does a better job of being customer in strategy when it's done well. I'm not saying there's not a lot of bad marketing, because there is plenty of bad marketing out there. But if you look at how it starts, and I've done this in multiple places, and because I was the CMO, I could do it. I could start at the source, right? When we put a brief together, okay, are we talking to an audience in one market, or will it be many markets? Okay, if it's many markets, great. How we approach the SEO, because the first thing we got to do is SEO. Is this English SEO or is this multilingual SEO? Because then that's the whole creative brief and the beginning of the marketing process. If you start it knowing it's multilingual, we will build the chassis differently, and we might even build it composable, so 80% of it can be reused. But we know we need new 20%, or we just determine, you know what, this only works for our US buyer. So now this tells us we're going to need something else for our German buyer or our German buyers, or what have you. And so if this gets right back to the source and source process, if you fix that, everything downstream becomes so much better and easier.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's easy, because Wayne lives it, right? Trying to push out from the middle. But it's easier for me to know in my executive roles to then say, I know I got to drive this. I got to drive the change in the way the marketing team even approaches customer experience or in content creation. And then I've got to go partner with my execution teams on how it all manifests in the various and sundry different ways it needs to manifest.
Yeah. So I think, Arl, I think one of the questions you asked there was like, what are maybe some misconceptions that executive teams have, or some, like, when they're even when they're supporting these investments in other markets. So first of all, there's like the fallacy of, if you build it, they will come. It doesn't work that way. All of this requires maintenance and work. And that's the other thing, is that localization, like if you decide to go into a market and provide your product and your document, I mean, you're in, and that's forever, at least until you turn it off. And so that's another thing that I've had to like make sure that executives understand, is like, we don't just localize a page once and then we're done and we check it off and we move on. It's like, that thing's a living document, and it updates all the time. I think the other thing too, and this dovetails on some of what Jamie was talking about, you could have like 50 people from 6 teams working on like a promotional video or something, right, in English. And then when they spend hours and hours and weeks working on these things and getting them perfect. And then it comes to localization, and the idea is, can we get that in 5 days, right? And expecting like the same level of attention and the same like effort that went in to communicate with that target audience for that content. It's so much harder to do that. And so I mean, yeah, you can turn those things around, but making them better and making them really sing with those local markets takes more effort than I think a lot of executives believe.
If I could just pick up on that, Danny, you said something on the, you can't just do it once. I reminded of an article or discussion I saw 8, 9 months ago, with maybe a little bit longer, with Elon Musk, about why he wasn't doing more paint, more color options for the Tesla. And he's like, look, you add another color, it isn't just that I sell it today. I think I'm going to maintain that paint, in perpetuity for these cars that'll be sold and resold. And so you're not just adding the ninth color isn't just adding 12% more effort on the initial build. It's adding 12% more cost and infrastructure to the whole company in perpetuity. And it's a super important point. But I'm always struck, Arl, as I listen to these conversations, and I don't know, it helps here, but to me this is so much of a change management issue. It isn't a localization issue. This is really how do we help this discipline helped the organization understand that we have to approach the market differently. And you can see it with, Wendy made a comment in the chat, about thinking global from the start. And it's the metaphor I always use. If you build a foundation for a two-story house and later decide you want to put a skyscraper on it, that is not going to go well. So you do, it's hard. It's particularly hard for startups to think this way. But if you have global ambitions, there's some decisions you want to make very early on that don't seem to necessarily make perfect sense, because they have profound impact for the cost of retrofitting and fixing later, which is really the story of a Loc manager, is how much effort is it going to take to retrofit the way this content or experience was initially designed for some purpose other than the one they're now asking me to make it fit for purpose for.
Yeah. I'm just going to toss in a few things from the comments here. One is my colleague Allison Toon. She didn't say this in the comments, but I think it's relevant. I've quoted her many, many times on this. And she said that the localization team are the garbage collectors of the documentation world. And everything rolls downhill and they have to deal with it. But then she says in the comments, a targeted content audit can really help with those disconnects, such as US created content not fitting the rest of the world. And we found organizations that do a content audit often are surprised at how poorly some of their stuff performs and how little they understand their audiences. And now it goes back to what Jamie's been saying, understand your audience. If you don't do that audit, you're just going off of assumptions that may or may not be valid. And so that gains you very valuable data for this. Then the other thing I'll say that's really interesting is a discussion that Matteo started talking about hyper customization, and his LLM is going to take away some of this need to do this internationalization from the beginning. And then Dominique in the comments points out that all this data, these LLMs tend to be trained on American English things anyway. And we've found some interesting cases, like you said, tell it to suggest an LLM to suggest good activities for a birthday party for a 12-year-old boy. You get a very American sounding list of things. And if you say, do it for a 12-year-old boy in Somalia, it describes what you'd suggest to a Somali American boy in Minneapolis, not to a Somali boy in Somalia. And so, yeah, some of this, there's some promise here, but the reality may fall short of it. So I think we still need to go back to these basics.
Of course, Arl, right? And I mean, like, that's no different than the early days of MT, right? In however you define the early days of MT, these things are only as good as what we train them on. And it's also why you can't just use the open models. If you want to do this for yourself, then you need to find a model, load it up with your content. It's trainable. Again, it's the translation business should be in the best position of almost anybody to get into the Gen AI universe. Given how long we've been thinking about machine translation or translation automation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'll put this in the chat, but one of my favorite metaphors, to your point, Arl, is if you have a polluted river, you fix it one of two ways: build a sewage treatment plant, which you can do, and it's expensive, or you can stop polluting the damn river. Right, which is longer and requires process change and attitude change, et cetera, but is actually the right answer, and it is inevitably it's much cheaper. And of course, I think the challenge for local leaders is both. It's both, because they're the garbage collectors. You are the sewage treatment plant for all of that content. So if you want to stop that, you've got to figure out how to win the hearts and minds and convince people to stop polluting the damn river to begin with, whether that's a content audit, change in content creation processes, even teaching them, to your point, they don't measure content data metrics. Okay, let's get into teaching them how to use content data metrics. Because if you don't solve that first order problem, you'll forever be debating the efficacy of the factory.
Okay. So, and this seems like a good segue to one of the other questions I had. We don't want to turn this into a generative AI question, but with the introduction of generative AI, is it changing in any way the sorts of data that you guys need and how your data is perceived? Or is it still the same?
I think this is a tough question to answer because there's so much we still don't know, right? But Gen AI is going to change everything. The hype is so loud, the expectations are so great. Our executives see dollar signs, they see increased productivity, they see reduced resources. They don't understand the challenges required to put these things in place, and the lead times and those type of things. But it's going to be at the forefront of everything we do regardless, right? And I think it's going to have an impact not just on us as an industry, but anyone in a knowledge worker type of role, or in a company which is primarily knowledge workers, right? So I don't know yet how it changes our need for data or how we have conversations with our stakeholders. I think right now I find myself defending why we can't just replace the translation process with Gen AI, and explaining the challenges and where we think that Gen AI can integrate with our processes and improve our processes, but not replace our processes. But yeah, I think I don't know if I know how to answer the question on will the data we need now be different than the data we need in the Gen AI world? I don't know.
I'll just toss in one of the things that we've tried to emphasize is that localization is doing a lot more than just translating words. And Gen AI can solve the translating the words, but there's all the process components and the other things that if somebody says, "Oh, we're just going to throw it out and send it to Gen AI," you've now lost all that capability that's needed to make it happen. And so I think it's having data on what it is that actually is involved and can articulate the value of everything you do besides translation is going to be vital. Because if all you do is translate, throw it out, replace you, and then organizations are left with no knowledge. They've just gutted everything and they can't perform.
Well, there's this, for some reason, there's this thought that you don't have to validate what comes out of Gen AI. Just like we had to do post editing today to validate what comes out of our TMs and what it comes out of our MT. But for some reason, like, people are like, well, just let Gen AI do it. Well, you still got to validate it. And guess what? Now you got to validate everything instead of only half of it that we validate today because of our 100% matches, because of all this other stuff. No, now in this Gen AI world, you got to validate everything. And how much is that going to cost?
No. Well, I'll give a concrete example with one of our data products. We need the headquarters location of a bunch of companies around the world. And I thought, well, I'm going to toss this out to ChatGPT and see how it does. And it actually did pretty well, returning me. I had to break it down, but I got about 1,600 companies' headquarters. But then I started looking, and it was about 90% accuracy. And I think it's going to take us longer to verify and find the 10% that are wrong than it would have just been to do it manually in the first place.
Today,
Yeah,
Arl,
today.
I mean, if I think about Wayne's point, this is going to be a journey, right? There are some things that the models can do today, and we should start to embrace them and use them. But it is not as if, Wayne and his whole team is unnecessary in 12 months. This will take, again, much, as MT, we learned with MT, it can do plenty of things. It will take time, and there'll be a point where we can go asymptotic on this. But what it does do is it pushes the, and you can see this with MT. What does it mean? It pushes you to the edge where you're the humans in the loop. The training and the data and how it all gets set up and tuned becomes really important.
Yeah.
The process in between, not so much, but then making sure you've got the right output, and that your target changes over time, your buyer changes over time. I mean, again, as a marketer, the content and the tone I would use to sell today isn't what I would have used 12 months ago. And any different than a startup pitching to VCs today can't come in with the same kind of messaging. So, your messaging is never static. Your product is never static, which means, that while what the localization teams do or manage will clearly be different, it's as dynamic as the business. But it does make data. Do you have the metadata around each piece of content? I mean, think about what is required then. Every piece of content's got which market, which ICP or persona, for which purpose, which outcome. So this is a totally non-language example, but it's a good, sort of connection point here. There's a tool that I've used in a couple companies called metadata.io, which helps us automatically craft all of the A/B tests for different kinds of marketing content. And then you give it the AI a goal. Does this content help drive web traffic? Does this content help drive downloads of this white paper? And it'll find the exact right mix of those things for that outcome. And then it takes all your money and pushes it towards the outcome. So you've got to watch what's happening or you'll burn a lot of money really fast. But you had to set this thing up really right. And if you give it 7 bad things to test, it's just going to put all your money against the best of the worst. So it's going to, there's so much need for, sort of the model management and the AI management, even as it gives us scale in all kinds of places we haven't had before.
So we're just about out of time. There's some really interesting questions. I wish we had more time to talk about, like how you articulate your value. Wendy's question. Wendy, I think we'll have to take that one offline just because of the time. But it's a fantastic question. But I think we're going to close with one thing is if you guys could somehow go back and talk to yourselves 15, 20 years ago and tell yourself one thing that you've learned now that you wish you'd known when you were younger around this area, what would it be?
Oh, for me, it's easily just the performance metrics, focusing there rather than the operational ones. There's a tendency to want to focus on the operational ones because it's easy and it's also like kind of representative of your work. And the performance part is hard because you have to learn different parts of the business and how they measure that success. But that's the thing that's gotten me the longest. I've gotten the most out of focusing on that than I have operational. So that's it.
I think similar to Daniel, it would be putting a bigger focus on stakeholder engagement, on data analysis, on business acumen in my hiring decisions and how I upskill my team over time. Definitely that.
I'll go to something Wayne said earlier, and this is true whether it's localization or whatever. Nobody cares about the thing. They don't care about language. And I know that hurts the linguists amongst us, deeply. But they don't, and they're not gonna, and it doesn't matter. So your job is to translate literally how that thing matters to the things they do care about. Right. And it literally doesn't matter whether you're trying to sell Gen AI or localization or social media as a channel or TikTok or whatever. Nobody cares about the thing. They just care about what it does for the business in some meaningful way. And so when you can get that, and it's not personal, so you should care about it and care about figuring out a way to translate it in a way that makes sense to that business, you get a lot further selling this stuff.
Okay. All right. With that, I think it's a good note to end on. I'm sure we could go easily another hour talking about these topics. But we appreciate the contributions of the panelists and all those of you who've made comments in the chat, either here on StreamYard or on LinkedIn. Please continue the discussion on LinkedIn if you would like to. There's the chat there, I think, remains active. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. And yes, the recording will be available. You can watch it on LinkedIn. I don't know how long it takes to post, but it will be available there. And certainly feel free to reach out to me or to any of the panelists if you want to continue the discussion. And with that, thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.